On the 28th of February, a certain goblin was introduced into the game. No, not those. Those have always been there. This little clown. He's a 35-year-old goblin businessman that has an obsession with spinning a wheel and getting punched. No, I'm not kidding. That's literally his lore. This update would go down as the second most controversial, surprisingly. Second most controversial update of 2012, with later that year, Evolution of Combat being released. It was the ultimate 1-2 punch to the community that saw a lot of dedicated players leave the game entirely, so let's dive right in. At first, it was fairly innocent, with Bible spins not even existing for around the first month. So, like I said, this came out 28th of February 2012. Spins could be obtained from quests and rare drops in small quantities, also certain distractions and diversions as well could grant you a ticket or two. I believe you also got a ticket at the time, I think 2 tickets for simply logging in for the day upon reset. So at first it was completely free, buyable spins weren't even a thing, and the loot was typically poor. It had a few cosmetics, a few lamps, 60 GP was on the table multiple times very commonly, and just generally junk. There were still lamps, but they weren't selling the spins at this point. It wasn't that controversial. People at this stage were more annoyed with the little pop-up they got telling them to spin the wheel. Only a few people at this time kind of saw the writing on the wall just from being experienced gamers and seeing other games go to the MTX or microtransactions route. They kind of saw this coming, but most of the player base at this stage did not see what was coming next. So the real trouble really began on the same year, about a month later on April 2nd. I just want to reiterate, the non-viable version of Squeal of Fortune was only around for a month before microtransactions were slipped in, so ultimately this was the plan the whole time. To say the least, the majority of the player base hated it. They instantly cited gambling as well as pay-to-win elements because you could get lamps and essentially buy XP. The counter argument to this at the time, and that I still see to this day, is it's going to cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $15,000 USD in order to fully max an account. Much of the community felt that it shouldn't be in the game despite its high price tag. Not only pay-to-win elements, but also accusations of real-world trading. This all culminated in a very large riot in World 66 at Valador, protesting the Squeal of Fortune and buyable spins. These ongoing riots were further fueled by Mod Timbo's response to certain players on the forums, as well as Jagex's official statement saying there's no way they're going back and that 90% of members are interacting with the wheel and 70% of free-to-play are interacting with the wheel. They use these numbers as a tool to just brush off any criticism and say the player base loves it. Through my research, what I found was very odd. Delving back into 2012, the big creators at the time, some of them that still exist today, weren't really actively speaking up against the buyable spins, not that they have to, and some of them were even buying the spins. Most of them were doing this as more of a test, but it's just interesting to see the positive or neutral viewpoint towards the buyable spins at the time, because I feel like if something like this was implemented into old school today, there would be full-scale riots and things would escalate very quickly. And while personally I'm not a business expert, nor do I pretend or claim to be, but what I think led to the initial introduction of Yelps and then eventually MTX a month later, and then also Evolution of Combat later that year, as well as a few other questionable updates in 2012, was Andrew Gower selling his share to get less responsibility within the company. From what I gather, and also what I'm about to show you guys, he still wanted some power of like what updates are coming into the game and wanted the final say, but also wanted less responsibility and stress. However, when he did that, he sold his share and he stepped down to a slightly lower position in the company. He found he did not have the last word anymore on updates and things coming into the game, and ultimately very few people or nobody really listened to him. There were people above him making decisions and they didn't care that he was the original creator or co-founder of Runescape. I'll let him explain it a little better. It's kind of sad. You can see the regret. I'm not an armchair psychologist, but it's pretty plain to see in my opinion. Let's take a look at that.
Runefest gave everyone at Jagex a spring in their step, but Andrew was beginning to feel distanced from the game he had created.
I wanted to get myself in a position where I could still advise Jagex and still, I loved RuneScape. I absolutely wanted to keep working on it, but I didn't want the responsibility and the stress of being in charge of something so big and so important. So I started looking at selling my remaining stake in Jagex, but it wasn't meant to be a radical shift, but it was just meant to be a way that I didn't have to be a director of a huge company.
He wouldn't have chosen to be the leader. Andrew always, the reason I even got the job in the first place was Andrew didn't want to be that guy, didn't want to be in charge. He wanted to write more code and hang around with the other guys, right? He didn't He didn't even want the visibility of people knowing he was the a meaningful shareholder or co-founder.
When Andrew came to selling the company, I wasn't enjoying it quite so much anyway, so I was reasonably happy to go along with that. So,
whilst I'd been quite stressed being in charge, I suddenly realised that when I wasn't in charge, all of a sudden what I had to say didn't matter so much, and people were doing things not the way I wanted them to do them, and that was the whole point, of course. The whole point was I didn't want to be responsible, and I just wanted to be able to advise and help and nurture the game I'd made without having to be so responsible. But as soon as that responsibility was taken away, I realised, oh dear, you can't have it both ways. Without responsibility, you also don't have the authority. You can't, you can't have one without the other. And by trying to make myself less stressed and reduce the responsibility, I'd also reduce the authority. And all of a sudden, I found that I didn't have the final say on things, and other people had the final say on things, and I'd made a mistake, quite frankly. Eventually just reached the point where I just wasn't doing anything for Jagex anymore, but there was no sort of date where I left. I didn't have a leaving do or anything like that. It just sort of faded away.
Almost exactly 2 years after its initial introduction, Squeal of Fortune would be removed. The initial announcements and news posts and teasers regarding this were met with praise and excitement, and it rose even further when a poll was created by Jagex to decide Yelp's fate. One of the options was to kill Yelps, and ultimately that's what won the Power to the Players poll, with 42% of the player base that voting to kill Yelps. This led to Yelps being implemented into the Mighty Fall quest as a boss fight. And at the end of the boss fight, you can either kill him or spare him. I don't know why you'd spare this little turd. But sadly, Yelps was just replaced with something that was seen as more overpowered than Squeal of Fortune. It was known as Treasure Hunter. Treasure Hunter was very similar to Squeal of Fortune, only with more promos, better prizes, typically due to those promos, a different graphic, and instead of tickets, it was keys. These promotions instilled a sense of urgency within the player base to spend their money, because these were only limited time. You want that exclusive outfit or that exclusive costume, don't you? You want a chance to roll for multiple lamps, don't you? You want a chance for those lamps to potentially give you more XP, don't you? Well, just buy spins or buy keys in this case, and your dreams will come true. Let's go ahead and just look at the sheer amount of developer time that is spent on the promotional material alone. Let's look at just some of the promos. This isn't even a small fraction of all the Treasure Hunter promos that have counted as updates or have been slipped in as part of another update. They are vast. Let's take a look at some. So after seeing that, you can see why it was a problem. And it was much worse, in my opinion, and most of the community's opinion at the time, than Squeal of Fortune. But ultimately, by this point, Jagex was going to do it. They had already got their foot in the door with Squeal of Fortune back in 2012, so there was no stopping them this time. And this is compounded by the fact that the player base's voice, as far as RS3 was concerned, was severely dwindled because some of the player base had gone to Old School, because this is 2014. Old School was released in 2013. So most of those players had already set their roots down in Old School or moved on to totally different games entirely. So due to these facts, any protests or dissenting opinions went out with a whimper. And ultimately, guys, that's it. The first of 2 updates in 2012 that led to a decline in players. A good old 1-2 punch, if you will. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There are many more to come. But anyways, guys, bye.